Today we will be programming for the conveyor belt robot. The first thing we need to do is to go ahead and go into our project and make sure our schematic editor is set up correctly before we jump into the programming. So on this robot, we will have our left wheel and right wheel, which are DC motors. Do make sure that the left wheel is reversed. There are no servos for this robot. But there is this one LEGO motor that's going to be used with our conveyor belt. So pause the video, make sure that your schematic editor looks like mine, and then we can go ahead and save and close our schematic editor. So then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to create our program. So it's going to be new VI and VI for NXT EV3 target. This will be our conveyor belt robot. So you want to put your name and then conveyor belt. And then I can go ahead and maximize my block diagram and right click anywhere to get my functions palette. I'm going to click the push pin so it stays, and I'm also going to go to customize and view this functions palette with icons and text. So our entire program is going to go into a for loop. To get our for loop, we're going to go to Programming, Structures, and then For Loop. And I'm going to drag a nice big for loop out. So the number of times this for loop is going to run will be 4. So I'm going to right click on the loop count, create constant, and put in 4. And the first thing that we want our robot to do is to search for the bucket, and it wants to keep searching until it's close enough to a bucket before it moves on to the next part of our program. So we're going to go ahead and take a while loop and put it down in the beginning of our program. And I want to move my DC motors until it sees something. So I need to go back to Mindstorm Robotics, IO, and then move motors, and I'm going to put that in my while loop. And then I'm going to create a constant on the top node for motors. And I want to be able to use these DC motors anywhere in my program. So I'm going to go ahead and select that initialize box and move it to the very outside so I can access it anywhere in my program. But I do need to reconnect my wire. So we have 2 motors. I'm going to click the down arrow, and I want to choose my left wheel and my right wheel for my DC motors. The speed that I need to give my DC motors is going to be 15. So I'm going to right click on power and speed 1, create constant. This is going to be 15. And I want the right wheel to also share that same power. So I'm going to go ahead and wire those 2 together. So then the next thing I need to do is to use the screen update block, and I'm going to use that to use the ultrasonic, the distance. So I'm going to go back to my main programming screen, and I'm going to open up screen update sub-VI. If you don't have this file, let your instructor know so that she can help you. But when I open that screen update, then I can just drag and drop the blue block that's in the top right corner of the window onto my block diagram to use in my program. So I'm going to connect from the right side of the DC motors, the move motors, to the left side of the screen update, my pink NXT wire, and that's going to determine order for my robot. I need to have the robot look at the distance it is away from the bucket. So I'm going to do a comparison. So I'm going to go back to programming, and then I want comparison, and this time I'm going to choose a less triangle. So on the right side of the screen update, I want to make sure that I wire from sonar distance to the input, so the X part of my less. And then I need a number to compare to. So for my y, I'm going to right click, create constant, and this is going to be 12. So then the result that it gets from that, so if I am less than 12 units away from the bucket, then I want to stop my while loop. So the very tip of the triangle, so sending out that Boolean true false is going to stop my while loop. And then I want to make sure that I'm continuing my NXT wire through. So once the robot sees that it's in front of the bucket, I want it to stop. So I need to go back to, Mindstorm Robotics, IO, and I'm going to put a stop motors. And it's going to be the same motors that I had before. So I'm going to go ahead and wire the top to my initialize box, this left wheel, right wheel. And then I'm going to go ahead and connect my NXT wire for order. So that will break my robot, stop my robot before it hits anything. Now that it's in front of the bucket, we want to move the conveyor belt. So I'm going to only have the conveyor belt run for a certain amount of time. So to do that, I can take a for loop and have it run only for a certain amount of loops. So that is under programming, and then structures and for loop. So I'm going to drag out a for loop. The number of times for this for loop, so I'm going to create a constant. This one is going to be 4 also. And inside my for loop is where I want to move my LEGO motor. So to get to my LEGO motors, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Mindstorm Robotics, IO, and this time I'm going to go down to complete. So that way I can access the LEGO motors menu. And I want motor on. So I'm going to go ahead and put that inside my for loop. I have to tell it which port my LEGO motor is plugged into. So if I right click and create a constant on the top, this one is going to be port A. So I need to change this to port A. I need to give my LEGO motor a speed. So I'm going to right click and create a constant for my power. And I want this to go 25% power. I'm going to go ahead and connect my NXT wire for order. And I can connect it to the border so I can use it later. So then I wanted to wait for a little bit before it backs up and it turns, so that way it can find the next bucket. So I'm going to go ahead and make my outer for loop bigger by dragging the blue dots. And I want my robot to wait before it backs up. So I'm going to go to Mindstorm Robotics, IO, and I want to wait for, so the one with the hourglass. And in this case, for my time, if I click that drop down, that wait for time, I want to change it to milliseconds, so MSEC. And the time, so the bottom left, I'm going to right click, create a constant, because we're going to put in 1500, so that way it's 1500 milliseconds. And I'm going to connect my NXT wire for order. And anytime it looks like this, where it's not a solid pink square, we can right click, go tunnel mode, and then last value, and that should make it our solid square. So then I need to stop my LEGO motor to stop my conveyor belt. So again, I want to go into the LEGO motors, which is under Mindstorm Robotics, IO, complete, and then we have our LEGO motors menu. And this time I'm going to have my motor brake. So if I right click on the top of my motor brake and create a constant, this is also going to be in port A for my LEGO motor. I'm going to connect my NXT wire. And then I want my robot to back up. So I need to use the DC motors to back my robot up. So I'm going to go back to my I/O menu. And this time I'm just going to do a move motors. And these are going to be the same DC motors, the left wheel, right wheel, that I had before. So I'm going to go ahead and wire the top of that move motors block all the way back to the beginning. To connect to that initialize box, that left wheel, right wheel. So for the power, this time when I create a constant, so right click, create constant, I'm going to have it go -30 because negative means go backwards. And I want the left wheel and the right wheel to both share that same power, so I'm going to wire them together. And then I need to make sure I'm continuing on that NXT wire for order. So after the robot backs up, I want it to wait before it turns. So I'm going to put another wait for block that's in my I/O menu. I need to change this to milliseconds again. So click the drop down, go to MSEC. And for my constant, so right click, create constant. This one is 800, so 800 milliseconds. Connect your NXT wire. And then this is the part where we're going to have the robot turn as it's backing up. So under my I/O menu, again, I'm going to put move motors. Now we can connect the top of this to that left wheel, right wheel in the beginning of the code, or we can also connect it to the same wire that we just had if you want. Either one will work. So my power and speed one, I'm going to create a constant, and that one is going to be 30. My power and speed 2, I'm going to create a constant also, but this one is going to be -30. So that way one wheel is going to go forward 30% power and the other one will go backwards 30% power, which will turn our robot. I'm going to connect my NXT wire. And then I want it to go ahead and wait before it repeats all of these actions again. So I'm going to go ahead and put a wait for block. And again, I'm changing this to milliseconds by clicking the drop down. I'm going to create a constant for the time. That one is going to be 700. And I'm going to connect my NXT wire. So then after my program runs, and it's going to run for 4 times because this whole program is in this for loop, and we told it to loop it, so run it 4 times. After it's done, I want to make sure my robot stops. So I'm going to go ahead and under the I/O menu, put a stop motors. I'm going to put that outside of my for loop. I'm going to wire the top of my move motors to be left wheel, right wheel, so I can share this wire. And again, anytime you don't have a solid square, just right click on it, go tunnel mode, and last value. And then I just need to connect my NXT wire for order, and again, right click, tunnel mode, last value. So now that we're done with the entire code, let's go ahead and click the broom, and that's going to squish the program along the NXT wire, and we can look at it a little bit to make sure that there's no errors. We should have a solid white arrow to make sure we have no errors. If you have a broken arrow, you need to make sure you ask your teacher for help.